All right, road to revolution here. For those of you who don't know, this is a picture of George Washington and his men, crossing the Delaware into New Jersey on Christmas Eve to attack a bunch of Hessian soldiers, which were German mercenaries fighting for the British. He repeated this act. This was December 31st. He repeated it again on January 1st at the outset of the fighting in the Revolutionary War. However, we are going to talk about the buildup to that point. These are the state standards that we're going to look at, or we're going to cover today. This is a timeline of over here of how all this went down. 1763, the French and Indian War ends, and then all the way over here in 1776 is when the Declaration of Independence starts. We're going to talk about what went on between 1763 and 1770. The American Revolution can just about be broken up into three different periods of time. So 1763 until 1770, 1770 until 1775, 76, and then 1776 when all the big fighting happened until 1783 when the war ended with the Paris Accords. All right, this guy. This was the King of England during this time. He ruled from 1760 to 1820. So throughout this entire time period, he was the King of England. He was the one the colonists were generally mad at, although in the beginning, they placed all their anger towards Parliament. What was going on? It's called King George III here in America, but in Britain he's called Mad King George because he was crazy. He had some kind of mental disorder. We don't know what it is, but he was crazy. But he was also trying to wrest control over England, over Great Britain, away from Parliament, because Parliament had taken up a whole bunch of control after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Parliament seized control over everything, and the monarchy was gradually getting a few more powers back, but King George III, he wanted all of them back. So there was a lot of political tension both in the colonies as well as in Great Britain proper. All right, the French and Indian War. I'll slide down there a little bit. It's fought between 1756 and 1763. These guys over here in this picture, these are a bunch of Scottish regiment fighting alongside their Iroquois allies. It was fought between France and England. Here in America, it's called the French and Indian War. In Europe, it's called the 7 Year War. Some historians will talk about it being World War Zero, because there were multiple world wars prior to World War One. This was one of them, where it was fought all over the world between France and England, and included their allies everywhere in the world. Here in North America, both sides had Indian allies. It began as skirmishes between Virginia and the Quebecois. Those were French Canada, basically. Quebec is French Canada. So again, 1756 to 1763. This is the way it was split up prior to. Remember Hudson Bay, Henry Hudson, he sailed for England. So England owned Hudson Bay. The French owned all of this land here. Spanish had all of this. After 1763, after the end of the war, England had all of this, and the Spanish had all of that. England did even get Florida at this time. So England won the war, and it settled the boundaries on the Appalachian Mountains. Those are these mountains, if you remember from your geography. Those are these mountains that go up here, this way. This angered the Virginians. The reason it angered the Virginians was because the Second Virginian Charter for the colony of Virginia extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Yeah. Nobody at the time knew how absolutely huge the North American continent is. So they didn't know where that colony would end. They didn't expect a 3,000-mile colony, but they knew it would be bigger than what Virginia is now. Now, also caused problems. All right, I'm going to back up a little bit. The way this started kicking off here in the Americas is this land here, over here in the Ohio River Valley, if you can see that, was French. The French weren't trading with the Native Americans. The English colonists were trading with the Native Americans in that, because the Native Americans, they still wanted to trade for goods and such. So the French were kind of ignoring them, and the English were trading with them. The French then moved down this way, and that's where the skirmishes started, because this was French territory and the English were walking around on it. One of the other things that angered a lot of the colonists was, after this French and Indian War, once those boundaries were set, a lot of the people who had fought in the war, including George Washington, were promised land in that Ohio River Valley. But in the aftermath, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 set all that land in that area as an Indian reservation, Native American reserve. So that angered a lot of people. In order to pay for that, the king and parliament, they set about the Stamp Act of 1765. It was intended to pay for the war that helped defend the colonists, but the colonists considered it oppressive. They were getting taxed without representation in parliament. They had no representation in parliament. They couldn't speak up for themselves before the powers that be about the taxation. To some extent, parliament agreed, and the Stamp Act was repealed, but in its place, the Townshend Acts were implemented. These were intended to raise revenue, and they were taxes outside of the colonies, but they also directly affected the colonies. It affected imports from England into the colonies, which raised prices on goods, which the colonists found unacceptable. So that's 1767. 3 years later, during one of the protests against these taxes, the Boston Massacre occurred. When this started as a mob, or actually, a group of protesters protesting in the streets. That came across a British soldier who was standing on his own, minding his own business. I don't even think he was on a post. They mobbed him. They surrounded him, started harassing him. He set up the call. All his buddies came. More soldiers came. They got in a clash. And just like today, at the protests where you have a front line of police and you have a front line of protesters, they were in a clash, going back and forth, arguing. And then somebody threw a snowball, hit the British. They thought they were under attack, so they fired. So all the British fired on the colonists. 5 colonists died during this skirmish, and it was used as anti-British propaganda. This is actually a wood cutting done by Paul Revere. If you remember him from Midnight Ride, Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. He used this. You see all the dead and bloody people down here, all the British firing, shows all the colonists as unarmed. The colonists weren't exactly unarmed, and they had started it, but this picture traveled around all through the newspapers and everything and became a big piece of propaganda for the colonists against the British. We got 3 years later again, Boston Tea Party. This is a response to the Tea Act. Colonists turned away ships carrying tea. Part of the Townshend Act increased the price of tea just because of the way they worked. The British lowered the price of tea so that it was less than the Dutch tea. So because the price of British tea rose so high, the colonists started using Dutch tea. Well, the British responded by lowering the price of British tea, but they made it a law that the colonists had to buy tea from Britain. Well, the colonists didn't like that because they don't like being told what they got to do. So they dressed up as natives. I think the specific tribe was the Mohicans, which were in the area. Dressed up as natives, rowed out into the Boston Harbor, climbed up on a ship, and dumped all the tea. Several $1 million worth of tea. They just tossed it overboard. Wasn't exactly a secret. They were just doing it to conceal their identity. Nobody was really fooled into thinking this was some kind of Native American raid. They were just trying to hide their faces, putting on the war paint, changing their hair and their clothes and everything. So in response, you get the Intolerable Acts. These closed Boston Harbor, meaning no goods could come and go, which angered a lot of merchants in Boston, moved trials to other colonies. Now, we say other colonies. I'm not talking about the British colonies in North America. They moved it to Nova Scotia, up in Canada. They moved it to Caribbean. One of the amendments in the Constitution says you have the right to a trial by jury of your peers. This was British common law at the time, and Parliament was now violating British common law just to punish the colonists. They abolished popular elected Massachusetts government. The Massachusetts legislature had been voted in by the people, and the Parliament, British Crown, abolished them. Quartered troops. The Third Amendment talks about no quartering of troops. At the time, because of this crackdown on Boston, the British were sending troops over. They had no barracks, they had no quarters, they had no place to live. So they would kick people out of their houses and have the British soldiers move in. And then also the Quebec Act. That's kind of the bottom level. Quebec Act. At the time, if you remember when we talked about religion, the English were Protestants, and they're still Protestants today, still a Protestant nation today, but the rest of Europe was Catholic. The French was a Catholic nation, as was Quebec, the French colony up in Canada. With the Quebec Act, they just let all the French Catholics in without having to change their religion. This angered a lot of people because continental wars in Europe had been fought between Protestants and Catholics just because of the religious differences, as well as British citizens, British subjects of the crown, had been persecuted for being Catholic. And now, all of a sudden, in just a massive reversal, they were going to let all these Catholics be British citizens. And the colonists didn't like that either. So these were all called Intolerable Acts, meaning they weren't going to tolerate them. With that, so this is 1774, next year, 1774, same year, 1774, they were, because of this, they were going to meet the next year in 1775 if their demands weren't met. So this is the first time delegates from 13 colonies met. There were other congresses that had met, but not all 13 colonies were represented. This is the first time they all kind of came together. So they declared only colonial legislatures may tax colonists. Since they didn't have any representation all the way across the ocean in England, they declared that only themselves could tax themselves. No taxation without representation, as it went against the colonists' rights. They still declared at this point in time, 1774, they still declared loyalty to the king, but they were also going to boycott his goods. And then they made a plan to meet in the next year if their demands weren't met. However, their demands weren't met. England, fearing rebellion, decided to march on Lexington in order to take the armory that was there. Lexington and then Concord, take the armory, get the cannons, the powder, the guns, the bullets, that kind of thing. Take it out of colonial hands. Paul Revere he was warned of this. He went on his famous midnight ride. He actually got captured up here. Another guy named Dawes set up to the south and met up in the same place. And Dawes was able to escape and continue the ride on. During this time, they warned the countryside that the British, that's this blue, the British were marching on Lexington, and they were able to rally the Minutemen. Minutemen was a special type of soldier, a special type of volunteer in the colonial militias that would have their gun and powder ready at a minute's notice. They could be out the door as soon as they got the call to arms. They could be out the door right away. This was mostly set up during the early colonial days in order to fight off raids from native tribes and also the French that were in the same area. French are kind of up here. This was repelled. The Minutemen showed up. They repelled the British march. They repelled the British assault. The British retreated back down here into Boston. As this is happening, the Minutemen tracked them and harassed them with fire the entire way down. They shot them as the British were trying to retreat. It was a rolling gun battle all the way back to Boston at that point. You can watch that on your own. Schoolhouse Rock, the shot that was heard around the world. That talks about the shot at Lexington. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Thank you.